Let's see who is here. Hi, Mr. Brown. Hi, Jay Patel. Hey. Hi, guys. We're going to start in about 30 seconds. Get yourself your excellent journal so that you can draw pictures and write down ideas. We today are getting ourselves prepared for a pretty significant chapter. Families of younger folk. There will be some powerful stuff in this chapter. If you feel like you want to preview it before we begin, or before they hear it, you may want to do that. But I will tell you that this is action-packed. We are going to have a really good chapter starting right now. Good Friday day. It is wonderful to see you today. As you know that we have a different time on Fridays. And so I am so glad that you were able to make it today. I'm so glad that you were present and accounted for. Thank you so much for being here. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to be finding out the further adventures of what happens when you put a bet out there and it might cost more than $2. I'm going to tell you that today we are going to find out a few things. There's some big questions sitting out and dangling in front of us before we start chapter 13. Number one, how is Billy feeling? Is he confident in his dogs? Does he believe that they will do something that no other dog has ever been able to do before? And that would be finding out where this ghost coon is when he heads towards the infamous tree that Rainey and Reuben clearly said was where he always goes once he starts getting himself tired out, as well as when the dogs start getting tired out. We also have these two not very nice boys who do really disrespectful things a lot of the time. And I think we need to pay attention to their actions today. I also want to pay close attention to who we've learned Billy is. I want to pay attention to the kinds of things we've learned about this guy. He is determined. He is very confident in his dogs. He is extremely passionate about hunting for raccoon. And so, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, we start chapter 13 of Where the Red Fern Grows by Wilson Rawls. Give huge credit to this man for creating this beautiful book. And so, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, remember the last thing we heard was this. He's there all right, Reuben said. He's in that tree. Well, come on, I said. I want to see that tree. You might as well get your money out, Rainey said. I told him he had said that once before, back on the riverbank. Chapter 13. All right. Coming up to the tree, I could see it was a huge bur oak. It wasn't tall. It was just the opposite. Rather a low and squatty tree, for a bur oak, that is. The top was a thick mass of large limbs, and it hadn't shed all of its leaves yet. Shed all of its leaves. Must be fall. It stood by itself in an old field. There were no other trees within 50 yards of it. About 15 feet to the left were the remains of a barbed-wired fence. An old gate hung by one rusty hinge from a large corner post. I could tell that at one time a house must have stood very close by. Do you see this? So you've got a big tree like that oak tree right there. And there's not a whole lot of anything around it except for what? a barbed wired fence. Now, a barbed wired fence, you might know as one of those that maybe if you drive into the country, you happen to see a post, and then you have that spiky wire that goes across, and then another post. And that is what we're talking about in this moment. So, Reuben saw me looking around. Long time ago, some Indians lived up here and farmed these fields, he said. I walked around the tree looking for the coon, but could see very little in the dark shadows of the night. Ain't no use to look, Reuben said. He won't be there. Rainey spoke up. This ain't the first time we've been to this tree, he said. Reuben told Rainey to shut up. You talk too much, he said. In a whining voice, Rainey said, Reuben, you know the coon ain't up in that tree. Make him pay off and let's go home. I'm getting tired. I told Reuben I was going to climb that tree. Go ahead, he said. It won't do you any good. The tree was easy to climb. I looked all over that tree. On each limb and in every dark place of that tree, I looked for a hollow. The ghost coon was not in this tree. I climbed back down, scolded old Dan to stop his loud bawling, and looked for little Ann. I saw her far up that old fence row, sniffing and running here and there. I knew the ghost coon had pulled a real trick, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Little Ann had never yet barked treed. I knew if the coon was in that tree, she wouldn't still be searching on the trail. Old Dan started working around again. My dogs covered that field. They circled the field and circled the field. They ran up and down the barbed wired fence on both sides of it. I knew the coon hadn't walked the barbed wired fence. Ghost or no ghost, no coon can walk a barbed wired fence. I walked over to the old gate and looked around. I sat down and I stared up at the tree. Little Ann came to me. Old Dan, giving up his search, came back to the tree and bawled a couple of times. Ooh! I scolded him. Reuben came over, leering at me. He said, You give up? I didn't answer. Little Ann once again started searching for the lost trail. Old Dan went off to help her. Rainey said, I told you that you couldn't tree the ghost coon. Why don't you pay off so we can go home? I told him that I hadn't given up yet. My dogs were still hunting. When they gave up, I'd give up. But not before. Reuben said, Well, we're not going to stay here all night. Looking back to the tree, I thought perhaps I had overlooked something. I told Reuben I was going to climb it again. He laughed. Go ahead. Won't do you any good. You climbed it once. Ain't you satisfied? No, I am not satisfied, I said. I just don't believe in ghost coons. Reuben said, I don't believe in ghosts either. But facts are facts. To tell you the truth, I've climbed that tree a dozen times and there just ain't no place in it for a coon to hide. Rainey spoke up. Our old blue hound has treed the ghost coon in this tree more times than one. Maybe you two don't believe in ghosts, but I do. Why don't you pay off so we can get away from here? I'll climb it one more time, I said. If I can't find him, I pay off. Climbing up again, I searched and searched and searched. When I got through, I knew the ghost coon was not in that tree. When I came down, I saw my dogs had given up. That took the last resistance out of me. I knew if they couldn't find the ghost coon, I couldn't. Digging those two $1 bills out of my pocket, I walked over to Reuben. Little Ann was right by my side. I handed my money over, saying, Well, you won it, fair and square. With a grin on his face, Reuben took my money. He said, I bet this'll break your old grandpa's heart, won't it? I didn't reply. Reaching down, I caught little Ann's head in my hands. Looking into her warm, friendly eyes, I said, It's all right, little girl. We haven't given up yet. We'll come back. We may never catch the ghost coon, but we'll run him until he leaves the country. She licked my hands and whined. A small breeze began to stir. Glancing up into the tree, I saw some leaves shaking. I said to Reuben, Looks like the wind's coming up. It may blow up a storm. We'd better be heading home. Just as I turned, I saw little Ann throw up her head and whine. Ooh! Her body grew stiff and taut. I watched her. She was testing the wind. I knew she had scented something in the breeze. Stiff-legged, head high in the air, she started walking toward the tree. Almost there, she turned back and stopped. I knew that she had caught the scent, but could only catch it when a breeze came floating by. Looking at Reuben, I said, I haven't lost that $2 yet. Another breeze drifted out of the river bottoms. Little Ann caught the scent again. Slowly, she walked straight to the large gate post, reared up on it with her front feet, and bawled the most beautiful tree bark I had ever heard in my life. Hoo! Old Dan, not understanding why Little Ann was bawling, stood and looked at her. He walked over to the post, reared up on it, and sniffed. Then, raising his head, he shook the dead leaves in that bur oak tree with his deep voice. Hoo! I looked at Rainey. Laughing, I said, there's your ghost coon. Now what do you think of my dogs? For once, he had nothing to say. Going over to the post, I saw it was a large black locust put there many years ago to hang the gate. Looking up at the tree, I saw how the ghost coon had pulled his trick. One large, long limb ran out and hung directly over the gate post. It was a drop, good 12 feet from the branch to the top of the gate post, but I knew we weren't after any ordinary coon. This was the ghost coon. I said to Reuben, boost me up, and I'll see if the post is hollow. After breaking off a long Jimson weed to use as a prod, I got up onto Reuben's shoulders, and he raised me up. The post was hollow from the top down. Not knowing how far down that hole went, I started the switch down. About halfway, I felt something soft with the stick. I gave it a hard jab. I heard him coming. He boiled right up into my face. I let go of everything. Hitting the ground, I rolled over on my back and looked up. For a split second, the ghost coon stayed on top of that post, and then he jumped. My dogs were on him the instant he hit the ground. The fight was on. I knew the coon didn't have a chance as he wasn't in the waters of the rivers. He didn't give up easily even though he was on dry land. He was fighting for all his life, and a good account he gave. He fought his way to freedom and made it back to the bur oak tree. He was a good 6 feet up on the side when old Dan, leaping high in the air, caught him and pulled him back down to the ground. At the foot of the tree, the fight went on. Again, the ghost coon fought his way free. This time, he made it and disappeared into the dark shadows of the tree. Old Dan was furious. Never before had I ever seen a coon get away from old Dan. I told Reuben I'd climb up and run him out. As I started climbing, I saw Little Ann go to one side and old Dan to the other. My dogs would never stay together when they had treed a coon. So that any way that coon decided to leave the tree, he was met by one of them. About halfway up, far out on a limb, I found the ghost coon. As I started toward him, my dogs stopped bawling. I heard something I had heard many times. The sound was the cry of a small baby. It was the cry of a ringtail coon when he knows it's the end of the trail for him. I never liked to hear this cry, but it was all in the game, the hunter and the hunted. As I sat there on the limb looking at the old fellow, he cried again. Something came over me. I didn't want to kill him. I hollered down and told Reuben I didn't want to kill the ghost coon. He hollered back, "Are you crazy?" I told him I wasn't crazy. I just didn't want to kill him. I climbed down. Reuben was mad. He said, "What's the matter with you?" "Nothing," I told him. "I just don't have the heart to kill a coon that great." I told him there were plenty more. Why kill him? He had lived here a long time, and the more than one hunter had listened to the voices of his hounds bawling on the ghost coon's trail. Rainey said, "He's chicken-livered. That's what he is." I didn't like that, but not wanting to argue, I didn't say anything back. Reuben said, "I'll go up and run him out." "I won't let my dogs kill him," I said. Reuben glared at me. "I'm going to go up and run that coon out," he said. "If you stop your dogs, I'm going to beat you half to death." "Do it anyway, Reuben," Rainey said. "I've got a good mind to," said Reuben. Just as Reuben started to climb the tree, old Dan growled. He was staring into the darkness. Something was coming. "What's that?" I asked. "I don't know," Reuben said. "Don't sound like anything I've ever heard." It's ghosts, Rainey said. Let's get away from here. An animal was coming out of the darkness. It was walking slowly and why, it's... One could see that the rope had been gnawed in two. Gnawed. Gnawed. The frayed end had become tangled in a fair-sized dead limb. Dragging the limb was what made the dog look so strange when it walked. I felt much better when I found out what it was. His chest was thick and solid. He came up to us growling. The hair on his back was standing straight up. He walked stiff-legged around old Dan, showing his teeth. I told Rainey he'd better get a hold of his dog or there was going to be a fight. You better get a hold of your dog, he said. I'm not worried about old Blue. He can take care of himself. I said no more. Hold on, I've got a helicopter flying over. Sometimes it happens. Sorry. You better get a hold of your dog. I'm not worried about old Blue. He can take care of himself. I said no more. Don't make no difference now whether you kill the ghost coon or not, Reuben said. Old Blue will take care of him. I knew the killing of the coon was out of my control, but I didn't want to see him die. I said to Reuben, just give my $2 and I'll go home. I can't keep you from killing him, but I don't have to stay and watch. Reuben, don't you give him the money, Rainey said. He ain't killed the ghost coon. That's right, Reuben said. You ain't, and I wouldn't let you now even if you wanted to. I told them my dogs had treed the ghost coon, and that was the bet, to tree the ghost coon. No, it wasn't, Reuben said. You said you'd kill him. It was no such thing, I said. I've done all I said I would. Reuben walked up in front of me. He said, I ain't gonna give you the money. You didn't win it fair. Now, what are you gonna do about it? I looked into his mean eyes. I started to make some reply, but decided against it. He saw my hesitation and said, you better get your dogs and get out of here before you get whipped. In a loud voice, Rainey said, bloody his nose, Reuben. I was scared. I couldn't whip Reuben. He was too big for me. I started to turn and leave when I thought of what my grandfather had told them. You'd better remember what my grandpa said, I reminded them. He'll do just what he said he would. Reuben didn't hit me. He just grabbed me and with his brute strength threw me down on the ground. He had me on my back with my arms outspread. He had a knee on each arm and made no effort to fight back. I was scared. If you say one word to your grandpa about this, Reuben said, I'll catch you hunting some night and take my knife to you. Looking up into his big ugly face, I knew he would do just what he promised. I told him to let me up and I would go and I wouldn't say anything to anyone. Don't let him up, Reuben, Rainey said. Beat him up or I'll hold him and let me beat him up. Just then I heard growling and a commotion off to one side. The blue hound had finally gotten into a fight out of old Blue or old Dan. Turning my head sideways, I could see them standing on their hind legs, tearing and slashing at each other. The weight of the big hound pushed old Dan over. I told Reuben to let me up so we could stop the fight. He laughed. Why, my dog's whipping yours. I think I'll just work you over a little. So saying, he jerked my cap off and started whipping me in the face with it. I heard Rainey yell, Reuben, they're killing old Blue. Reuben jumped off me. I clambered up and looked over at the fight. What I saw thrilled me. Faithful little Ann, female that she was, had gone to the assistance of old Dan. I knew my dogs were very close to each other. Everything they did was done as a combination, but I never expected this. It is very rare to see a female dog fight another dog, but fight she did. I could see that little Ann's jaws were glued to the throat of that big hound. She wouldn't loosen that deadly hold until the last breath of life was gone from the blue tick hound. Old Dan was tearing and slashing at the soft belly. I knew the destruction his long, sharp teeth could cause. Again, Rainey yelled, Reuben, they're killing him. They're killing old Blue. Do something quick. Reuben darted over to one side, grabbed my axe from the ground, and said in a loud voice, I'll kill those hounds. At the thought of what he was going to do with that axe, I screamed and ran for my dogs. Reuben was about 10 feet ahead of me, bent over, running with the axe held out in front of him. I knew I couldn't get there in time. I was screaming, "No, Reuben, no!" I saw the small stick when it whipped up from the ground. As if it were alive, it caught between Reuben's legs. I saw him fall, and I ran on by. Reaching the dogfight, I saw the big hound was almost dead. He had long since ceased fighting. His body lay stretched full length on the ground. I grabbed old Dan's collar and pulled him back. It was different with little Ann. Pull as I might, she would not let go to that hound's throat. Her jaws were locked. I turned old Dan loose, and getting a straddle of little Ann, I pried her dog jaws apart with my hands. Old Dan had darted back in, grabbing his collar again. I pulled both of them off to one side. The blue hound lay where he was. I thought perhaps he was already dead, and then I saw him twitch a little. Still holding my dogs by their collars, I looked back. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. Reuben was laying there where he fell. His back was toward me. His body was bent in a U shape. Rainey was standing on the other side of him, staring down. I hollered and asked Rainey, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" He didn't answer. He just stood as though in a trance, staring down at Reuben. I hollered again. He still didn't answer. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't turn my dogs loose. They would go for the hound again. Again, I hollered at Rainey, asking him to come and help me. He neither moved nor answered. I had to do something. Looking around, my glance fell on the old barbed wire fence. I led my dogs over to it. Holding onto their collars with one hand, I worked a rusty barbed wire backwards and forwards until it broke. Running the end of it under their collars, I tied them up. They made 2 or 3 lunges toward the hound, but the wire held stiff. I walked over and stopped at Rainey's side. Again, I asked, "What's the matter, Rainey?" He didn't say a word. I could see that Rainey was paralyzed with fright. His mouth and eyes were opened wide, and his face was as white as chalk. I laid my hand on his shoulder. At the touch of my hand, he jumped and screamed. Still screaming, he turned and started running. I watched him until he disappeared off into the darkness. Looking down at Reuben, I saw what had paralyzed Rainey. When Reuben tripped while running towards our dogs, he fell on the axe. As it entered his stomach, the sharp blade had sunk to the eye of the double-bitted axe. That means it's gone all the way inside his belly. Turning my back to the horrible sight, I closed my eyes. The muscles in my stomach knotted and jerked. A nauseating sickness spread over my body, and I couldn't look at him. I heard Reuben whisper. Turning around, I knelt down by his side and my back to not look at that axe. I couldn't understand what he was saying. Kneeling down closer, I heard him and understood. In a faint voice, he said, "Take it out of me." I hesitated. Again, he pleaded, "Please, take it out of me." Turning around, I saw his hands were curled around the protruding blade as if he himself had tried to pull it from his stomach. How I did it, I'll never know. Putting my hands over his and pressing down, I pulled the axe from the wound. The blood gushed. I felt the warm heat as it spread over my hands. Again, the sickness came over me. I stumbled to my feet and stepped back a few paces. Seeing a movement from Reuben, I thought he was going to get up. With his hands, he pushed himself up. His eyes were wide open, staring straight at me. His mouth opened as if to say something. Words didn't ever come. Instead, just a red bubble slowly worked its way out of his mouth and burst. He fell back to the ground, and he was dead. Scared, not knowing what to do, I called for Rainey. I got no answer. I called his name again and again and again. I could get no reply. My voice echoed in the darkness of the silent night. A cold chill ran over my body. I suppose it's natural at a time like that for a boy to think of his mother. I thought of mine, and I wanted to go home. I wanted to go home real bad. Going over to my dogs, I glanced to where the blue hound was. He was trying to get up. I was glad he wasn't dead. Picking up my lantern, I thought of my axe. I left it. I didn't care if I ever saw that axe again. Knowing I couldn't turn my dogs loose, I broke off enough of the wire to lead them. As I passed under the branches of the bur oak tree, I looked up into the dark foliage. I could see the bright eyes of the ghost coon looking down. Everything that had happened on this terrible night was because of his very existence. But it wasn't his fault. I also knew that he was a silent witness to the horrible scene that had just occurred. Behind me lay the still body of a young boy just a year older than me. On my left, a blue tickhound lay torn and bleeding because of my dogs. Even after all that had happened, I could feel no hatred for the ghost coon and was not sorry that I let him live. Arriving home, I awakened my mother and father. Starting at my grandfather's mill, I told everything that had happened. I left nothing out. My mother had started crying long before I completed my story. Papa said nothing. He just sat and listened. When I had finished, he kept staring down at the floor in deep thought. I could hear the sobbing of my mother in the other silence. I walked over to her. She put her arms around me and said, "My poor little boy." Getting to his feet, Papa reached for his coat and hat. Mama asked where he was going. "Well, I got to go up there," he said. "I'm going to go get Grandpa, for he's the only man in the country that has the authority to move a body." Looking at me, he said, "You go across the river and get old man Lowry, and you may as well go on up and tell the Bufords too. Tell them to meet us at your grandfather's place." I hurried to carry the sad message. The following day was a real nasty one. A slow, cold drizzle had set in. Feeling trapped indoors, I prowled from room to room. I couldn't understand why my father hadn't come back from the Pritchards. I sat by the window and watched the road. Understanding my feelings, Mama said, "Billy, I wouldn't worry. He'll be back before long. It takes time for things like this." "I know," I said, "but you would think that he'd be back by now." Time dragged slowly by. Late in the afternoon, I saw Papa finally coming. Our old mule was jogging along. Water was shooting out from under his feet in small squirts at every step. Papa had tied the halter rope around the mule's neck. He was sitting humped over with his hands jammed deep in the pockets of his patched and worn Mackinaw jacket. I felt sorry for him. He was soaking wet, tired, sleepy, and hungry. Telling Mama, "Here he is." I grabbed my jumper and cap and ran out to the gate and waited for Papa. I was going to ask him what happened at the Pritchards, but on seeing his tired face and wet clothes, I said, "Papa, you better go into the fire. I'll take care of the mule and do the feeding and the milking." "That'd be fine," he said. After doing the chores, I hurried to the house. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to find out what happened. Walking into the front room, I saw my father had changed clothes. He was standing in front of the fireplace drinking coffee. "Boy, it's bad weather out there, isn't it?" he said. I said it was and asked him about Reuben. We went to the old tree and got Reuben's body. Papa said we were on our way back to the Pritchards when we met them. They were just this side of their place. They had started to look for him. Rainey had been so dazed when he got home, they couldn't make out what he was trying to say, but they knew it must have been something real bad. They wanted to know what had happened. I did my best to explain the accident. It hit old man Pritchard pretty hard. I felt sorry for him. Mama asked how Mrs. Pritchard was taking it. Papa said that he didn't know, as he never did get to see any of the women folk. He said that they were the funniest bunch he had ever seen. He couldn't understand the Pritchards. There wasn't one tear shed from any of them. All the men had stayed out at the barn. They never had been invited in for a cup of coffee or anything. Mama asked when they were to have the funeral for Reuben. "They have their own graveyard right there at their place," Papa said. "Old man Pritchard said that they'd take care of everything and didn't want to bother anyone. He said that it was too far for anyone to come and it was bad weather too." Mama said that she couldn't help feeling sorry for Miss Pritchard and she wished they were more friendly at this time. I asked Papa about Rainey. Papa said, according to what old man Pritchard said, Rainey just couldn't seem to get over the shock. They were figuring on taking him to town to go see the doctor. In a stern voice, Papa said, "Billy, I don't want you fooling around with the Pritchards anymore. You have plenty of country around here, so you do not have to go out there to hunt." I said I never would, and I never did. I felt bad about the death of Reuben. I didn't feel like hunting and kept having bad dreams. I couldn't forget the way that he had looked just before he died. I moped and wandered around in a daze. I wanted to do something, but I didn't know what it was. I explained my feelings to my mother. She said, "Billy, I feel the same way and would like to do something to help, but I guess there's nothing we can do. There are people like the Pritchards all through the hills. They live in little worlds of their own, and they're all by themselves. They don't like to have outsiders interfere." I told my mother I had been thinking about how dangerous it was to carry an axe while hunting, and I had decided I'd save a few coon hides and get a good gun. Boy, I just shouldn't have had mentioned getting a gun. My mother got sitting hen mad. "You are not getting a gun," she said. "I won't have that at all. I told you a long time ago you could have had one when you are 21 years old, and I mean just what I said. I worry enough with you out there in the hills all hours of the night running and jumping, but I couldn't stand it if I knew you had a gun with you. No, sir, you just forget about a gun." "Yes, Mama," I said. I sulked off to my room. Lying on my bed, still trying to figure out what I could do to help, I glanced over to the wall. There, tied in a small bundle, was just what I needed. Some time back, my sisters had made some flowers for decoration day. They had given me a small bouquet for my room. Taking them down, I could see that they had faded a little and looked rather old, but they were still pretty. I blew the dust off and straightened the crinkled petals. Putting them inside my shirt, I left the house. I hadn't gone far when I heard something behind me. It was my dogs. I tried to tell them I wasn't going hunting. I just had a little business to attend to, and if they would go back, that I'd take them out that night. It was no use. They couldn't understand. Circling around through the flats, I came to the hollow above the Pritchard place. Down below me, I could see the graveyard and the fresh mound of dirt. As quietly as I could, I started easing myself down that mountainside. Old Dan loosened a rock. The further it bounced, the louder it got. It slammed up against a post oak and sounded like a gunshot. I held my breath and watched the house. No one came out. I glared at old Dan. He wagged his tail, and just to show off, he sat down on his rear and started digging at a flea with his hind leg. The way his leg was thumping in the leaves, anyone could have heard it for a mile. I waited until he quit thumping before I started on. Reaching the bottom, I had about 20 yards of clearing to cross, but the grass and bushes were pretty thick. Laying down on my stomach with my heart beating like a trip hammer, I wiggled my way to Reuben's grave. I laid those flowers on the fresh mound of earth, and then turned around and scooted for the timber. Just as we reached the mountaintop, my foot slipped and I kicked loose a large rock. Down the side of that mountain it rolled. This time the blue tick hound heard the noise. He came out from under the house bawling. "Hurr!" I heard a door slam and Mrs. Pritchard came out. She stood looking this way and that way. The hound ran up to the graveyard and started sniffing and bawling. Mrs. Pritchard followed him out. Seeing the flowers on Reuben's grave, she picked them up and looked at them. She scolded the hound and then looked up at the hillside. I knew she couldn't see me because the timber was too thick, but I felt uncomfortable anyway, like she could see through the trees. Scolding the hound again, she knelt down and arranged the flowers on the grave of Reuben. Taking one more look at the hillside, she started back. Halfway to the house, I saw her reach down and gather her long cotton skirt in her hands and dab at her eyes. I felt much better after paying my respects to Reuben. Everything looked brighter, and I didn't have that funny feeling anymore. All the way home, my dogs kept running out in front of me. They would stop, turn around, and look back at me. I had to smile, for I knew what they wanted. I stopped and petted them a little and told them that as soon as I got home and had my supper, we'd go hunting. How do you feel? It's kind of a hard thing, huh? Did you expect it? Were you a little worried about what might happen in that moment? Were you surprised by that moment? Was it hard? Did you need to close your ears maybe? Maybe close your eyes because you were kind of imagining it too much and maybe you needed to get away from it a little bit? That's okay. I had that same feeling the first time I heard it. It took me by surprise. I didn't expect that to happen. I'd never heard that in a book before. And that's okay. It's natural. There comes a time when you discover something new in a book. And that was one of those moments when I first heard that. I had never heard something like that in a book before. How do you feel? Do you feel like it was a good idea for Billy to sneak out to the Pritchards? How did that help him? What gave him strength after that? What do you think Rainy's feeling right now? Do you feel sorry for Rainy? Do you feel sorry for Reuben? Or is that little piece of you kind of like, no, he deserved it? Some people are going to feel that way. Ah, Jay, you've got some feelings, huh? Nobody deserves that, I don't think. Or at least that's my perception. What did you think about the ghost coon? What did you think about the idea that Billy wanted to keep it alive? That's pretty cool, huh? I thought that was a pretty interesting concept, that Billy had that. Were you surprised that Billy decided to let it live? Were you surprised that Reuben wasn't going to let it go and was going to kill it himself? That's the kind of stuff that we kind of figure out with. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, chapter 13 is a real powerful chapter. But if you didn't read the stuff before it, you're not going to get as much out of it. And that's the reality about a book. You got to start at the beginning and get to know your characters. You got to get to know where you're at. You got to fall in love with some things. You got to hate other things. You got to find out what you think is going to happen. And that's the fun part about reading. So it is Friday. It is time for you to head out. I want to give some props to Miss Olga McGeeshig's class. I hear they've been joining us. I want to give some props to the Dorner family, my old graduated class. The Sloans have come. Hello, it's good to see you guys. Every one of you from Gwyn Oaks who has decided to participate, you are awesome, 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 awesome. Chapter 14 will be at 3:30 on Monday afternoon. I wonder what you will do between now and then. I hope beyond hope that you do everything in your power to live a life that is absolutely splendiferous. Don't fall on any axes. Don't be that silly. Don't be that cruel. Be more like Billy. Hey, that kind of rhymed, didn't it? Maybe I'll write a poem this weekend. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I hope you have a great weekend. Thanks for being here, and share this with your friends. They're worth hearing this story too. Love you, and get out of here.